Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we have with us an award-winning investigative journalist straight from Canada, Andrew Mitrovica. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. And if I might add, he's also a journalism instructor and professor at Sheridan College in Toronto. And he's also a columnist for Al Jazeera. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So just to recap for our viewers, we've seen now it's been about 2 weeks since Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made explosive claims on the floor of the parliament against India, saying that his government is investigating a potential link between the killing of a Sikh separatist and Indian agents being perhaps involved in that. Now, we've seen a lot of developments since then, tit for tat, expulsions of diplomats. More recently, reports have come out that, reports specifically in the Financial Times have come out that Indian officials were perhaps orally briefed by their Canadian counterparts before Trudeau made these claims on the floor of the parliament. India has also asked diplomats from Canada to be reduced in India, and so on and so forth. So, Andrew, we have seen a lot of analysis on what could have motivated Trudeau to make these claims against India. A lot of analysts have focused on the Sikh vote, how it's been important to the Liberal Party for many years. Some have also made claims that the Liberal Party has been sympathetic to the Khalistan cause. But you have actually suggested that rogue Canadian spies are to blame for what we're seeing. So could you elaborate a little bit on that for our viewers?
Well, what I've been writing about is my skepticism about many of the claims that are coming from the Canadian government. And I think that skepticism is born of my history reporting on Canadian intelligence services and intelligence services more generally across the world. It was not too long ago when the former Secretary of State of the United States held up a vial famously during a UN Security Council meeting and suggested that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction and that we should take his evidence as gospel. And I have been trained as a journalist to be skeptical of the official story wherever it comes from. And I think too many reporters, particularly in Canada, have fallen into line and have accepted as gospel Prime Minister Trudeau's allegations in the absence of substantive or concrete proof. As you point out, there have been a number of leaks in the days since the Prime Minister made his allegation on the floor of the House of Commons. But what I was getting at in my piece was that was motivated, I think, by two things. First off, Mr. Trudeau has, for much of the year, been embroiled in what I believe to be a manufactured scandal surrounding so-called Chinese interference in Canada's domestic politics. And he has been lambasted for being ineffectual and weak on this issue. So here was an opportunity for the Prime Minister to show that he was getting tough on a foreign government, in this case, ironically, a strategic ally, and that he was, if you examine the timeline of events, he was as I do in one of my columns for Al Jazeera, he was essentially forced to do that because word had leaked to a newspaper that I previously worked for that about this allegation, right?
Globe and Mail?
The Globe and Mail, yes. I was an investigative reporter at the Globe and Mail. So he was actually forced to do that by the very same intelligence officers who were leaking information, cherry-picked bits of information about so-called Chinese interference. So on the one hand, I think that the address was targeted for a domestic audience insofar as it was intended to show that the prime minister was no longer soft on foreign interference, whatever the nature of that foreign interference was. But secondly, and I think more importantly, and I think this is an important nuance to the story, is that he was essentially forced to do that because word had leaked to the Globe and Mail, who were planning on running the story. So in effect, as I argued in one of my pieces, Canada's foreign policy is essentially being driven by rogue intelligence officers who are leaking potentially explosive information meant, I think, to enfeeble and to embarrass the Prime Minister of Canada.
So what you're saying is before it was about Chinese foreign interference in Canada, and those same rogue spies, as you call them, have now a new target, which is India. Is that right?
Yes. I think that
to follow up on that,
pardon me?
To follow up on that, who are these spies or spooks, as you call them? Are they serving intelligence officers? Are they former intelligence officers? Is it reflective of CSIS as a whole, or are these just a few bad apples?
I wrote a book about Canada's Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, one of only 2 books written about CSIS, which should tell you a lot about how many reporters in this country keep a jaundiced eye on that intelligence services. Who are they? It's very difficult to say. I wrote a column some time ago urging them to come forward because the construct that my former newspaper has built around these officers is they're whistleblowers. Well, I beg to differ. I think whistleblowers tend to come out of the shadows and tend to point an accusatory finger in the light of the public domain. And then they explain their motivations. They explain the evidence that they have. These are not whistleblowers. I'm not sure who they are. I suspect that that to some extent they are serving intelligence officers. I do think that they are working in concert with former intelligence officers who are appearing quite regularly on Canadian television and in other media to stir up these issues. And this is not the way, I think, that these very serious bilateral, multilateral issues should be addressed. They shouldn't be addressed, as you pointed out in your introduction. The Financial Times, of all places, is getting leaks from intelligence services. This whole issue should be explored in a much more serious and persuasive and cogent way, rather than depending upon leaks from intelligence services either in Canada or overseas. And so, who are they? I don't know, but they are causing a great deal of trouble, and they should ultimately be held to account for what they have done, because it has, as we've seen, had very serious consequences for Canada's multilateral and bilateral relationships with alleged allies in one case and an adversary in the other.
Building on that, you just mentioned allies, which brings me to my second question about reports coming out that the US is one of the Five Eyes ally, which provided intelligence to Canada. And I know you've covered this very extensively. You've written a book on the Canadian security intelligence called Covert Entry. You've covered this extensively. What do you think about the claims that the US was the one who provided very critical intelligence about an alleged link between Indian agents and Sikh separatist killing? And if you do believe that the US was one of the allies who did so, what does it gain? What does Washington gain by having Canada go down this path?
Well, the interesting aspect about Five Eyes is this, because we are being told, Five Eyes, for your listeners, your viewers, is a consortium of intelligence services made up of electronic intelligence, eavesdropping intelligence services, made up of the Communications Security Establishment in Canada, the National Security Agency in the United States, GCHQ in England, and their Australian and, curiously, their New Zealand counterparts. You would not have thought that New Zealand would have rated being a member of Five Eyes, but they do. In any event, what I find interesting is that the whole raison d'etre of Five Eyes is supposed to protect democracies from adversaries, right? From our strategic, economic, diplomatic adversaries. And what the leaks have shown is they spy on each other. They spy on democracies. So, and nobody has really pointed that out. India is supposed to be a strategic ally of Canada and the United States. Mr. Trudeau and President Biden traveled to Delhi recently, met with Mr. Modi, and now we learn. Guess what? Five Eyes are spying on India. It seems a little curious that that's taking place, and nobody's really addressed that issue. And of course, this is one of the revelations of the Snowden revelations, is that these institutions that are supposed to be intended to protect us are, in fact, they're spying on one another. Mm-hmm. So, and they're spying on their so-called strategic and democratic allies, which I thought in and of itself would have been an interesting revelation that would have caused some friction between the Indian and American governments. What, you're spying on our diplomats? I thought we were friends, you know? And it's a point that seems to be missed in all of this controversy. Now, what do they gain? That's a very good question. What do they gain? Because, of course, it undermines to some extent America's emerging relationship with India as a geopolitical power in the subcontinent. And it is causing some friction. What I want, and I think what both your Indian audience, Canadian audience, we need to see this evidence. It can no longer be the subject of leaks to news organizations, whether they're in the United States, India, or Canada. There has to be what is the evidence so we can assess how persuasive it is, because we still don't know what the evidence is. For example, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party, made mention of the fact that he had a private briefing with presumably security officials, and that he was shown the so-called evidence. Well, that's fine, but the public is owed the same courtesy, I think, both the Indian public and the Canadian public, because there is obviously some disagreement there. And I am not of the camp that automatically believes everything that is said by my government, or its security officials. Journalists ought to be skeptical and not accept holus bolus as gospel what is being said to them by government officials, particularly in the world of security intelligence. We want to see the evidence. Now, of course, the argument is, well, we can't show you the evidence because it might undermine our abilities or it might expose our modus operandi when it comes to gathering the information. Well, either you trust the Canadian public or you don't. And I think the time has come to put into the public domain more substantive, more concrete evidence to show whether or not these allegations have some merit.
So two things on what you said, actually. One, it's been 2 weeks. As we know, no evidence for Trudeau's claim has been provided either to the Canadian public nor the Indian public. The Ministry of External Affairs in India has repeatedly said it has not received any specific information about the case, but it is more than prepared to look over any information should it be provided. In fact, our foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, recently had an interaction in the US with press and academics, where he said that the Indian side has not seen any evidence. But coming back to what we were talking about with regard to the Sikh separatist movement in Canada, and Nijjar's killing is very important in this case, because now we're seeing Sikh separatists in the UK start to question the death of another separatist called Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who had died in a hospital in the UK.
Yes.
So I wanted to speak to you about Sikh separatism in the UK, in Canada, and organized crime in the community. We know that Hardeep Singh Nijjar had a rival known as Malik, who died a few weeks before he did, in fact, and they had openly threatened each other in public as well during this time. And a lot of reports after Nijjar's killing in June had actually suggested it had much to do with gangsterism and gang rivalry. What is your take on that? And is there anything you can elaborate on how crime has affected the community?
You know, these are questions that need to be explored because it does provide an alternative theory and a plausible one, I think, in the absence of information. So if in the absence of concrete evidence, you get conjecture, right? You get conjecture. So the conjecture might be, well, the root of the killing might be somewhere else, rather than some, as being alleged by the Prime Minister, essentially a murder plot organized by elements of the Indian government. Well, in the absence of concrete evidence, alternative theories are then floated. So I come back to the point that I made earlier. I think it's a more judicious Prime Minister would have got up in the House of Commons and said, we have established, right, instead of potential link, right? Because as a journalist, you understand that these are universal weasel words, right? If you want to say something is true without proving it's true, you use the word link, right? You use the word link, right? And that's precisely what the Prime Minister did in his address, right? And a more judicious Prime Minister would have waited, but he couldn't wait because the Globe had the leak. You have to understand the chronology of events. And they went to the Globe and Mail and said, we need more time, essentially, give us a week, presumably to gather the evidence and to be able to present it in a coherent and cogent manner. But then he makes his address to the House of Commons and he says there's a potential link. Well, that is a long, long way from saying we have established proof, right, that this is indeed what happened. And in the days and weeks since, despite these sort of ambiguous assurances that, yes, there is evidence, we still haven't seen the evidence. So to your point, in the absence of concrete evidence, other theories should be entertained. Other theories could be equally as plausible, but I can't give you an answer because I don't know what the evidence is. We still don't know what the evidence is. The Indian government, as you say, says that it hasn't seen the evidence. The Canadian government, through a series of leaks, has apparently insisted that it shared some of these evidence, that it took up the matter directly with Prime Minister Modi. Well, this is all just, it's not a serious way, in my point of view, of dealing with an explosive allegation that has disrupted to its core a important strategic, diplomatic, and economic relationship not only between Canada and the United and India, but it's also implicating the Americans as well, which is probably even more important, right? So where is the evidence?
Well, what do you expect of the investigation? Do you think it's completely tainted and prejudiced at this point? Or do you think
No,
we can expect something substantial to come out of it?
I think what is happening is that that there is, in all likelihood, some tension within the security intelligence apparatus and the political imperative to share, as I've said, some of the evidence, because the security intelligence apparatus, their argument is probably, look, you can't share too much of the evidence because it might reveal our sources. It's the standard line, right? We might reveal our sources, our modus operandi. Well, you've already admitted publicly that you're spying on Indian diplomats, okay? Presumably in country, in Canada and elsewhere. Now, who's doing that spying? How long was that spying taking place? Who was being spied on? Right? And all of those questions. So I think this is probably some tension between the security intelligence infrastructure and the politicians who keep alluding to this evidence and wanting presumably to share some more evidence, but the security intelligence infrastructure is saying, no, you've got to be restrained. I'm keeping an open mind. I'm keeping a skeptical mind. And I think more journalists, both in Canada and India, should be much more skeptical about the official story. And we should be asking questions and demanding to see this evidence that apparently exists that proves. But he didn't say that in his statement in the House of Commons. He said that there was a potential link between Indian agents. And I go back to that point. That is a long, long way from saying, and I think a more judicious prime minister would have waited to say, here is the proof that establishes that India was involved in the murder, right? We still do not have that weeks after the fact. Whether it will come, I don't know, but it should come because we've caused a great deal of upset, both in India, in Canada, and in Washington.
And even if Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, had a meeting with security officials about it, so did the British Columbia Premier, David Eby, and he ended up telling reporters that after he came out of that meeting with CSIS officials, he realized everything he was told was available on the internet. And he, in fact, yes, he did. And he urged the intelligence agency to provide more information, even if it exposed them. But my last question for you, Andrew, because you have actually...
That's a very interesting point. Again, too many journalists have do not remember the lessons learned when senior government officials, based upon so-called intelligence, said, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, here's the proof, right? And it turned out to be all hogwash. We should remain skeptical until we see it, and we can ourselves assess how persuasive that evidence is. And if the Premier of British Columbia is raising questions about the persuasiveness of the so-called evidence, that should give everyone pause.
Lastly, Andrew, I know you've written about Maher Arar and Hassan Diab. They are Canadian citizens who were in fact tortured by authorities in France and the US on suspicions of terrorism. You've written a lot about that, in fact argued that it's part of Canada's poor track record of protecting its citizens. So, I mean, this might seem a little far-fetched of a question. So, but is Canada trying to prove something with Nijjar's killing?
If it's trying to prove something, I think that the argument that the Prime Minister made in raising the allegation by suggesting that it was evidence that the Canadian government, and more particularly the security services, have been and are committed to the defense of Canadians is in and of itself, I would say, patently false. Mayor Arar, Hassan Diab, other Canadians, non-white Canadians, were, in Mr. Arar's case, were handed over to torturers in Syria with the complicity of the security services that Prime Minister Trudeau says defend the interests of Canadians. Well, I think that would be news to Mr. Arar. Hassan Diab has been accused by French authorities of I would say really rabid French authorities as being complicit in the bombing of a synagogue in the 1980s, and he was released by French magistrates because there was a lack of proof. And yet the Canadian government didn't protect his interests because he was subsequently convicted in absentia and was in effect extradited to France with the complicity of the Canadian government. So this suggestion by the Prime Minister that all Canadians, that the security services of Canada are intent on protecting the interests of all Canadians, that's just hogwash. And I think if this the other question that hasn't been really addressed is the suggestion is that the security services in Canada, CSIS and the RCMP, approached Mr. Nijjar and said, look, you might be in harm's way. Well, how did they let it happen? Let's say hypothetically, they knew something bad was going to happen to him, to the point that they warned him. Well, what happened? What happened between the warning and his death? Did you suddenly forget about him? Did you stop following him, keeping tabs on him? What happened? What happened between the warning and his shooting? Because reportedly, they warned him that his life was in danger. Well, why didn't the Canadian government protect a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil from whomever was responsible for his death? That's a question that hasn't really been addressed either, because too many reporters have already decided India is at fault. India is to blame. And anybody who questions that narrative is a stooge of Delhi. It's the same argument that we heard with Iraq. If you questioned the intelligence, you were a stooge of Saddam Hussein. What I'd like to know is, how did the intelligence services and the police drop the ball between the time that he was warned, apparently, you might be killed, and when he was killed? Somebody explain that to me. How did the CSIS, and CSIS is not in the police business, but the RCMP certainly is. How did they permit it to happen if they knew it was likely to happen? You see my point, Pia?
I do, and I feel like there are going to be a lot more questions unanswered. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light on this very complex topic that is sure to develop more in the months to come. Thank you.
My pleasure.